Thank you everyone for joining us today for our webinar discussion on how ESG is shaping the construction industry. I'm Jessica Tresham and I'm a partner in the construction and engineering team here at Gowling WLG. I specialise in disputes, but as a team and as a firm, we have a deep interest in ESG, not only how it's shaping the construction industry, but also in turn the ways in which our clients and the industry as a whole is responding. We're going to start the session with an overview of some key ESG themes. Then we're going to move to social value. What does it look like when it's done well? We're going to discuss ESG from a client's perspective, and we're joined today by Cressida Curtis from the contractor Waits. And then finally, we're going to have a quick look at ESG disputes and trends. As I said before, we're going to conclude the session with a Q&A, so send through your questions. So, by way of introduction, and to discuss how ESG is shaping the construction industry, I am joined by Ben Stansfield, a partner at Gowling and co-chair of our ESG, Shah Begum, an outreach and impact manager at the United by 2022 Legacy Charity. Shah is on secondment from our construction team where she works as a senior paralegal. I'm also joined by Cressida Curtis, who is the Group Sustainability Director at Waits. And finally, James Ignotis, who's a Principal Associate in the construction team at Gowling. Right, without further ado, I will hand over to Ben, our co-chair of ESG, who's going to have a little look at some of the key ESG themes. Over to you, Ben.
Lovely. Thank you, Jess. Good morning, everyone. We're just going to get our slides up. I'm going to talk to you this morning about four key topics. I'm going to focus more on the sort of the environment and the real property elements of ESG, conscious that Shah and others will be talking about the social aspect. So I'm going to talk to you about whether there is a presumption against development at planning. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about construction materials and sustainable construction materials, construction phase emissions and air quality. Big issue there. And I'm going to talk to you about benchmarks. And I think, it's important just to sort of highlight the real impact that the real estate and construction sectors have for carbon. So if we think about global aviation, that's 2.5% of our carbon emissions. And yet that gets a huge amount of media interest and column inches. But construction is responsible for 40%. So I'm not an accountant, but that's what, 10, 15 plus percent, or sorry, 10, 15 times the amount of aviation. So, the bulk of those are operational. So 28% of our global emissions are from heating and cooling and powering the buildings that we live and work in. And 11% of those global emissions are from materials and the construction techniques we use. So this is a really major topic worthy of our consideration. So if I could have the first slide, please. So this first topic is going to be around the presumption against demolition. And I've got some rather crazy AI generated images there, so apologies for that. And it was only having produced these images that I was told that AI has a bigger carbon footprint than if I just found the pictures online. So I'm breaking all the rules here. So you might be aware of the Marks and Spencer's headquarter building on Oxford Street, built in the 1930s. Quite handsome, and Marks and Spencer's sought planning permission to knock it down and build a new headquarter shop. And Westminster City Council, the local authority, were quite keen on this, but Michael Gove, a former Conservative minister when the Conservatives were in power, made a holding direction. So there was an inquiry. The planning inspector recommended demolishing the building and granting permission for the new one. But Michael Gove disagreed, and a number of issues, but particularly on sort of aesthetics and the carbon assessment of the building. So he said no planning permission. Marks and Spencer's developer appealed that decision, and it went to the High Court. And the High Court said Michael Gove was wrong with his application of planning policy, and they quashed his decision. And the new government needs to take that decision again. But it all suggests that we might be moving towards a much greater focus, real analysis of the carbon emissions, the embodied carbon associated with knocking down a building, glass, steel, and concrete structure, and rebuilding something. We don't have national policy on this, but you may be aware the new government are consulting or have consulted on a new national planning policy framework, the national document, which sets out all the various planning policies which decisions must be taken against. And I think it's pretty safe bet that there will be something in the NPPF on this presumption against demolition. There's nothing really particularly helpful in the London plan on this yet. I mean, there are some circular economy policies, and in there you'll find that of all the waste in London, only 17% comes from domestic sources. 54%, more than half of London's waste comes from the construction and demolition phases. So there's a real, as well as carbon, there's a real waste issue that we need to address there as well. And again, in the London plan, there is some information or some requirements around requiring developers to undertake a whole life carbon assessment of the building. Already, we've got 9 London boroughs. I've not done the research, at least 9, not done the research nationally, but we've got at least 9 in London who are thinking about retrofit first. So they're either got draft policies out for consultation or they're thinking about introducing policies which will require developers to assess the carbon footprint of knocking down and rebuilding. So even if the NPPF doesn't go as hard or as strong as some of the environmentalists might like, we can be fairly sure that some local authorities will be pushing pretty hard for that. And this doesn't say that you can't demolish. This simply says, before we give you permission to demolish, you've got a few more hoops to jump through, and you've really got to demonstrate that's the right thing to do, and you can't sort of go back to shell and core and then rebuild. So it isn't dreadful news for those in demolition, but it is going to make developers work a little bit harder. So now I'm going to talk to you briefly about sustainable construction materials. And as I've already said, glass, steel, and concrete are the fundamental building materials in the modern day, and those are all particularly carbon-intensive industries. So there now needs to be, or there is now increasingly, a focus on what we can do to have low carbon materials. So it might be that we have green steel, but increasingly, we might have sustainable timber. So timber from UK or European sources that's been grown sustainably and will be replaced. Biodiversity and nature are addressed as part of that sort of agricultural process. But we're now seeing timber frame commercial buildings being built, including in London. So after this webinar, please do Google Land Security's Timber Square in Southwark, where a fairly large commercial building has been developed using timber. And at the beginning of my career, 20 odd years ago, things like insurance, how do you get a sustainable timber structure building insured? How does that deal with fire risk, post Grenfell, all those kind of things? Those issues are now starting to be addressed and being overcome, and tenants and lenders and insurers are getting comfortable with it as well. So the image there, we might not be going down the straw and bamboo route yet. Certainly not perhaps at commercial scale. Might have to watch Grand Designs to get inspiration there. But so yeah, sustainable construction materials, we're now starting to see those, and we're now starting to see them again starting to be thought about in terms of the fit out as well. So when buildings are being refurbed, we're starting to see clients specify sort of recycled plastic carpeting, all that kind of stuff, reusable or rather reused and repurposed furniture as well. So these again are issues that are starting to come onto the agenda. Okay, construction phase emissions. So we've spoken about how significant the impacts during the construction phase are in terms of carbon, but I think the real issue here is in terms of air quality. Construction emissions are currently unregulated. That's not part of the building regulations, but the London plan talks about the non-road mobile machinery, so diggers, dump trucks, cranes, all that kind of stuff that mobile machinery is not allowed to go on the road. The exhaust emissions for those are really significant. So we've got serious amounts of particulate. We've got nitrous oxide emissions. I've missed out the micrograms per cubic meter there, and a great deal of carbon as well. Now, these are obviously talked about the carbon, but it's more about the air quality in particularly urban areas, generators and sort of perhaps engines that haven't been maintained to quite such high standards. Really impacting local air quality. So we're starting to see some local authorities address that in terms of either their planning policies or requiring developers to have cleaner machinery as part of planning condition or Section 106 agreements. But it feels like we're some way off there. There's a lot of challenges around the power sources. How are you going to charge these? How are you going to charge these plants? Is that a hydrogen issue? Is it batteries? How do towers get their power as well? So it feels to me like there are a number of obstacles yet. It feels like we're some way off. There are one or two developers who are trialing this technology and being really responsible in terms of their explaining what they're doing, having their development websites, talking about some of the challenges and sharing the information with their development community. And then finally, I just wanted to talk about some of the ESG benchmarks. So I think the wider issue here is that delivering a building or a structure that meets certain benchmarks goes to value. Our clients want to increase the either sale prices or they want to increase rental or make their building more attractive. So we're increasingly getting more and more of these ESG benchmarks, whether as a planning requirement in terms of BREEAM or as contractual requirements vis-a-vis their contractors. When I started my career, BREEAM seemed to be the only show in town, but increasingly we're getting things like GRESB, which is obviously very internationally popular, 17,000 assets globally. We've got NABERS, always get that wrong, an Australian benchmark which looks at sort of much wider issues in terms of water and waste and indoor environment. And you can see we've got others there, wide score in terms of how well internally wide for tech buildings are as well. So as many of these sort of green benchmarks that our clients can achieve, the better. It's likely to improve, as I say, the value and demand. And I think the important thing here is to look at what planning requires. Typically, town and country planning permissions are only requiring BREEAM, but again, that might change as some of those benchmarks become increasingly popular, increasingly prevalent, I guess. And I think this all comes down to what client stakeholders are wanting. What are their investors looking for? What are their customers? What are their future tenants wanting to see? Generally driven by the commercial side rather than customers and stakeholders. But again, I think we're going to see for a little while yet more and more benchmarks, which is going to be confusing for all of us. But hopefully, after a few more years, 3 to 5 years onwards, maybe some consolidation of some of the larger benchmarks as they start to absorb various issues there. And I think that brings me to time, Jess.
Thanks, Ben, and for that oversight of essentially the E and the G of ESG. What we wanted to look at now is the S. So I want to introduce to you Shah Begum, who, as I said before, is our head of outreach. Is head of outreach and social value at United 2022. And Shah's going to be looking at what does the S look like when it's done well. So thank you, Shah. Over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Shah Begum. I'm a senior construction paralegal at the team at Gowling. For the last 4 years, I've been on a 6-month secondment to the Birmingham 2022 Commonwealth Games and now to the Legacy charity, where I'm head of outreach and social impact. My role at the Games was to lead on the measurement and verification of the game's social value and also to help communities navigate their way through the landscape of the Games. In legacy mode, I'm continuing to work on the rolling out of our expertise and knowledge in this sector to anyone who has an interest in this subject and who wants to learn more about how we did it and how we can implement it ourselves. So I'm going to talk you through our model that breaks down how social value can be embedded and measured in organizations. When I talk about social value and how you can do an end-to-end process, and particularly to people who are coming at this fairly new, one of the things I'm reminded of is, how do you eat an elephant? And my answer is 1 bite at a time. And in this case, in 5 easy bites. Now, Before I tell you what those bites are, a very quick reminder of what social value is. It is the positive value an organization contributes to society beyond the money they spend in operating their business and the profit that they make. So to look at it another way, if you take corporate and social responsibility, which is quite broad, quite generic, quite vague, and ESG, which is all about meeting regulations, limiting damage, some of the things that Ben has spoken about. Social value is that space in between where these two overlap, and we see the positive contributions emerging. Now, this is essentially our model, our 5 bites of the elephant of how you can unlock social value in 5 easy steps. You map it, you create a menu, you make it easy, you match make, and you measure it. And you might recognize yourselves as being on some stage of these 5 steps. You might be not quite further on as some of your peers, or you might have already done this and you're looking to kind of take it up to the next level. So let's start with the mapping. It's all very well saying that we're going to measure and report on our social value, but what kind of things will make that positive contribution? How could it bring together the things that the organising committee and the suppliers were doing, in my case at the Games, and ensure that it's cohesive and it all pulls in the same direction? So we carried out a mapping exercise. So we started with a regional needs analysis, pulling together data from various sources like the indices of multiple deprivation, NHS information, Department of Education, information on skills, environmental data. And this gave us a really starting point picture of what the needs of our communities were, and also gave us some pointers as to where we might like to encourage people to concentrate their social value efforts. We then applied this analysis against the 5 mission pillars that we had at the Games. So that's that yellow circle that you can see there. And our mission pillars were bringing people together, improving health and well-being, helping the region to grow and succeed, putting the region on the map, and to be that catalyst for change. So some of these pillars map well against the regional needs analysis. Others didn't, but on the whole, they did align quite well. And then we spoke to the Games stakeholders to identify what their key priorities might be in terms of social value. So West Midlands Combined Authority, key stakeholder, their kind of thing was all about skills and apprenticeships. Birmingham City Council was focused on health and well-being, community cohesion. So you add all of that into the mix as well. And when you pull all of these threads together, that bit that emerges in the middle gives you your social value strategy. And in our instance, it was a public document that set out our vision and mission for the social value strand, our strategic focus, and our channels for delivery. And at the time, I'm talking 4 years ago, it was a very bold move as it set out some clear expectations of all of our stakeholders and gave a reference point for all of our activity. In your own organisations, I would say a similar framework is entirely applicable. What are the needs of the region that you are working in? What are your own priorities as an organisation when it comes to ESG? What are the needs of your stakeholders, so your funders, councils, that kind of thing? And finally, the needs of the communities where the activity will actually be taking place. What's the change that you're trying to create there? And where possible, I would encourage you to use the channels and networks that already exist in those communities to find the answers to some of these questions. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. Now, once you've got your strategy, what do you do? Well, strategy is only as effective as its execution. And to execute it, you need to socialize it, secure the buy-in, think of what the scaffolding is that you will need around it, roll it out, and support all of the partners at every stage. So it's not all of the bits of the strategy will be relevant or of interest to everyone. So it's being mindful of that as well. And in our world, we put the social value strategy in our website. It was available for everyone and anyone to download. And we held briefings with all of our stakeholders who'd been involved in developing that strategy to explain how their input had shaken out and what it meant for them. But also I kind of embarked on a world tour of our internal teams to explain what our thought process was around social value and the roles that they might play in unlocking social value through their own work, or what we could leverage through our supply chain. The biggest sales pitch was to those with procurement responsibility. Those colleagues are extremely busy. They've worked on lots of major events before. They've never had to bother with this before. And they didn't always have the time or the bandwidth to just run with the strategy. So we had to patiently get to know what their challenge is. And we rolled out training and developed a resource bank with templates and how-to guides to make their lives easier. The linchpin of our social value strategy was that we would ask all of our suppliers for a social value commitment that was equal to 10% of their contract value. And I know now that that's quite market standard. I have seen them as high as 40%. But this had never been done before in a major event setting. And our procurement people were nervous that it would perhaps put people off from bidding, would put extra resource pressure on them. So I'd really, really bring our procurement managers on side, explain what we were doing, how they might need to adapt some of their usual processes and practices. So, for example, including social value questions in the tender requirements, and then we would support them to score those. Now, this approach would still hold true if you're rolling it out in your own organisations. I'd come around and speak to your various teams in procurement, legal, finance, and work with you to establish the tools. In other words, how do you like this particular bite of the elephant solved? We did this from a standing start at the Games, but I know from speaking to people in the construction sector that most organisations already have started some pockets of this work. So a phased rollout, maybe starting with some key contracts each quarter, might be an approach that suits you better. But at the same time, we also wanted to bring in communities because a key element of our social value strategy was to unlock social value at a local level and ensure that as far as possible, all of the opportunity stayed within our region. So we started to speak to grassroots charities who were doing great work, aligned with the mission pillars that I mentioned earlier. And we brought them into a network and we started to get to know them, what they did. We invited them to have input into some of our programs. And you'll see why this was important a few bites on. So as far as possible, we wanted to make things easy for everyone concerned. And the best way to do that is offer training, support, and to be in people's faces, reassuring them that this was a good thing to do and that we're not just going to let them sink or swim and that we were able to help. We worked closely with procurement, finance, legal to explain that, social value covered a whole variety of things and, it should be used as a guiding star. It set out our priority areas. It explained what we wanted suppliers and stakeholders to contribute to. But on the other side of the procurement fence, you also have to bring on board those suppliers and sponsors. In your case, it might be funders, and help them to understand and see the value in what you're doing, and also make it easy for them, not just your internal teams. So we got involved with conversations with suppliers and potential suppliers. We put on boot camps that explained what we were looking for in the answers to the social value questions. And we also said that, look, we have created a menu in our social value strategy, which we would like you to consider when you're putting in the answer. We're not interested in shiny CSR programs that your marketing team might have dreamt up. So, tidying up a community garden. But could you do something that supports the same organization that runs the community garden to maybe shore up its HR policies, to get its social media up to scratch, to look at its safeguarding, for example? And this is where kind of our network of charities, our United by Family, as they came to be known, we started to bring them in and develop their capacity to work with corporate organisations as well. We've held on to that family. It's now 500 strong, and we continue to work with them and support them to access opportunities, build their organisational resilience, and kind of be partnership ready when a corporate comes knocking in the West Midlands looking for a grassroots charity. Now, you might think what was the point in investing in the Charities Network, Sharp? What's that got to do with anything? Well, they're actually a really crucial piece of the jigsaw when it comes to bringing everything that I've talked about so far into kind of this beautiful, radically collaborated work of art. So we work with our suppliers and internal teams to understand the commitments that they've made. We've mapped them centrally so they're not forgotten about. And we could say kind of like where the spread of the commitments were across the strategy as a whole. So if everybody was promising volunteering hours, could we do more to encourage apprenticeships or local work experience placements, for example? But you can't push for that without a central register that's constantly monitored. We also continued our dialogue with suppliers. Some of them never done this type of thing before, and we worked with them to come up with the projects that they could deliver. We talked to them about the existing projects that our United by Family were already delivering that they might like to support and scaffold the delivery on. And a lot of our suppliers were not based in the Midlands. So, they were parachuting teams in to deliver the event, and then they were shipping out to kind of the Dubai World Cup straight after. They really wanted to engage with the process, but they weren't sure of the third sector landscape in the region and what that might look like. So because we'd built that infrastructure and that capacity in our United by 2022 family, we became Cilla Black and did the whole matchmaking piece and introduced our suppliers to all kinds of wonderful charities within our network. So, you don't have to establish that network for yourselves. These networks exist in most places. So if you're in the West Midlands, I have a network, but also most places up and down the country will have a voluntary sector council, an active partnership, community development trusts that will have those connections and that local knowledge. So, lean into that. And the last and most important stage of all, please measure it. A strategy that you spent so much time and attention rolling out, securing buy-in will mean nothing if it's not measured and reported on. How could you know that it was all worth it without measuring and reporting on it? I think most of you are familiar with the national framework called the UK TOMS framework, which stands for Themes, Outcomes and Measures. Anybody who's not quite familiar with this, I'd be happy to have a separate chat and buy you a donut and explain the TOMS framework from first principles. But essentially, it lists a whole host of interventions, measures that could be classed as having a social benefit. So things like employing a care leaver or a program to deliver EDI to your staff internally. It takes a whole host of these things and assigns them a monetary value in pounds, shillings, and pence. There are a whole range of tools available. I'm happy to talk to anyone who wants to explore the tools. I'm certified to deliver some of those tools. But our the best fit for us was to use Social Value Portal. So we procured that central measurement tool. We developed the resources and tools for all of our internal teams and suppliers to capture the evidence that we use to measure and independently verify their social value. We continue to support our internal teams with uploading evidence to our data capture site. If people had promised 100 hours of work experience, how were they getting on? Were there any barriers that we could help them with? One thing that I would like to draw out here is that if something is not working, pivot with panache. If your suppliers are struggling with a particular type of commitment and you've tried to work with them to identify the blockers, it's just not working. It's okay. Let's look at something else that they might do. And, the numbers and the evidence are great, but what about the individual people, the human interest stories and the case studies? Don't forget about capturing them too, because they will be what brings your numbers and your figures to life. They provide a really rich source of marketing materials, internal comms, reporting to your stakeholders, things to put in your annual report. We captured these as part of our contract management process as well. So how did we do? What was the magic number? So across the top in pink, you can see that we have our inputs. So our procurement budget for the measured elements was 75 million. We had the organising committee's internal operating budget of 120 million. We'd put in the end-to-end training for the whole process and everyone involved, and also our local charities network. And across the bottom in blue, we have the outputs. So all told, we generated £300 million worth of verified social value, independently verified social value, which is phenomenal and far surpassed everyone's expectations. And within that, you can see how some of that is broken down and contributed to that figure. Okay, so each of these numbers have a whole host of gorgeous case studies behind them that tell you the local impact and the people level importance of these projects. And I've got a barrage of case studies. You're all welcome round to ours for a cup of tea and samosas to hear all about them. In legacy mode, we're continuing to deliver a number of programs to help reach the unusual suspects in our region and make those communities that didn't or couldn't engage with the games get a slice of the legacy benefits. We are on track to deliver £1 million worth of social value, verified social value ourselves as a charity with just 18 months of activity. I've got a model that I've talked you through, and we'd really like to help as many organisations as possible to join us on the journey and to understand and embed that model within their organisations. So all of the tools, the training, the templates that I've talked to you about, I'm really happy to speak to anybody that's interested in that kind of thing. So I hope you found that useful and you can see how your own organisation might implement it as a framework. And I'm happy to take any questions later on or connect with people on LinkedIn. But for now, I will pass back to Jess.
Thank you, Shah. And it's really fascinating, I think, to hear about the legacy from the game and the games and the work that has gone on after it. And I think having just seen the Paris Olympics and when they're all over, you sort of think, oh, that's over. But to sort of understand the work that goes on behind these huge events is is fascinating. So thank you so much. And am I right in saying that in terms of your kind offer to discuss these issues with people, that's anywhere, doesn't matter if it's in the Midlands or not, you're happy to share some thoughts on this with people if they'd like to get in touch?
Yep. This model is replicable anywhere up and down the country. As I mentioned, the charities network that we have, they exist all the way up and down the country. And I've been speaking to combined authorities in Manchester, I've spoken to a couple of councils up in Scotland, Northern Ireland, a few in London. So anybody and everybody who is interested, whether you're public or whether you're in the public sector, private sector, or even if you're in the third sector and would like to understand a little bit more about how social value can help your organisation, please do get in touch.
Well, thank you again, Shah, for that very interesting talk. We're going to move on now to obtain a bit of a client's perspective, and I'd like to introduce to you Cressida Curtis, who's the Group Sustainability Director at Waits. There she is. Hi, Cressida. Thanks for joining us today.
That's a pleasure.
We're going to have a bit of a chat, really, just to find out a bit about your role and the work that Waits is doing in this space. So, as I understand it, you fairly recently joined Waits as the Group Sustainability Director. Could you tell us a bit about that role, what it comprises, and why Waits has engaged you to undertake it?
Yeah, I'd love to.
Thank you.
Just as a little context, Waits has been going for 127 years. So we're quite a long-standing player in the sector. And we cover the entire life cycle of buildings, right through from an empty plot of land to end of life and reuse. But we've grown over that time to be about £2 billion of turnover. So we're substantial. We have scale, we have reach. Yeah. Interestingly for me, we are still family owned. We have the fourth generation of the Waits family currently in the boardroom. So I hope that gives you some flavour of what we're like as a business. This role that I took on in January, it's a new role. It's completely dedicated to environment and social value. And it's on the executive committee, so the main decision-making body of the group. And the drivers for the business were that we've always been purpose-driven to some extent. But in recent years, there's been a really sharp focus brought to that. And we had a new chief exec come in last year who is entirely purpose-driven. He says, you get the purpose right, you follow that, and profit will follow. And we've also concurrently seen a significant increase from our customers. We've roughly got half of our turnover coming from the public sector, half from the private sector across commercial and residential. And what we wanted to find out was, how can we create the best possible environmental and social outcomes really well every time, very efficiently, with the ultimate aim of evolving our business model to make excellent environmental and social performance a natural outcome of what we do every day. So a real shift in how we're thinking as a business.
So you're a large construction contractor, as you said. You've been in business for well over 100 years. Yeah. So how does a large contractor like you approach ESG?
So there is a sense that we've always
That's a big topic, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I suppose, how do you do? Do you sort of sit down and say, right, this is what we're going to do? Do you have perhaps, key objectives for each year? Perhaps you could sort of tell us a little about how.
Absolutely.
How it goes.
I think probably it's worth just thinking about how we sort of approach the big picture. I think about it in two buckets. The first is absolutely minimizing any environmental harm. And we heard from Ben earlier the extraordinary impact that our sector has on the environment. But that also means that we could be a huge part of the solution. So minimizing the harm is the first piece. And then in the second bucket, it's maximizing environmental and social value that we create through our day-to-day activities. On the minimizing harm piece, this is a really interesting agenda. We have recently reviewed our legal and obligations register, And we've identified 265 individual legal obligations that may or may not apply to any of our 150 projects. So there is a logistical piece there of how do we efficiently ensure that each project understands exactly the legal obligations that pertain to them, what they need to do to ensure that they are legally compliant, and to give us the strategic view to make sure that everyone is where they need to be. And then, of course, upskilling everyone so that they have the information and the skills and they're comfortable with how to go about this and where to go for help. So that first bucket is really big. It's incredibly important. No one wants to end up being the Thames Water of the construction industry.
And I imagine as well that's a significant financial investment for the
Yeah,
business,
it can be.
to start filling that first bucket.
Yeah, it can be. And the important thing is to do it really efficiently. So understand your business, understand where you are today, and do a gap analysis and make sure you know what you're going after. We're very, very clear of how we want to operate, the level of assurance we want at board, at group, and at business unit level, and what that means, where the accountabilities lie, and how we're tracking it. It takes a lot of organization. This is deeply unglamorous. This is not about saving polar bears. This is about just making sure we do the right thing every day on every site. It's really important. And it can be quite a heavy lift if you're starting from scratch. We've been going for quite a long time, so there's good things in place. We're just making sure that we are upgrading them as new products come on the market or as new legal obligations come through.
So this must be a hugely collaborative approach across the business then. So it's not you sitting in your role telling everybody what to do. It's
God,
sort of getting that culture change, I suppose, and ethos running from the very bottom all the way up to the top, or perhaps the other way round.
Yeah,
Is that fair to say?
Exactly right. No one in this business wants to harm the environment, but sometimes people aren't aware that what they do could harm the environment. So that's the tricky bit that we have to navigate, helping people understand what those precise legal obligations are without making it sound as though they're doing something wrong already, and just equipping them and supporting them to do it really well. But it is a cultural piece. You either have it in your business or you have to work to put it there, most definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we've seen that in our industry, for example, in terms of sort of bringing EDI concepts into the profession and
Right.
really ingraining that within the business. And it is a culture shift, most certainly. But
Yeah.
like I say, we're really doing that well now here. What would you say are the main drivers and challenges for the sector as a whole? Because I've sort of heard you talk about, all the things Waits are doing well as a large business, but looking perhaps at other smaller contractors that want to, adopt the same culture and ethos and have the same drivers. What would you say are those drivers and challenges?
Well, if we move away from the sort of mitigating risk bucket and we think about the wider agenda on environment, we've all got to realize that we only hold part of the puzzle. If we want to reverse the impact that we have on the environment and be a force for good, and I think Ben was talking about the move towards a presumption against demolition, and that's really important for our sector. That's a wholesale shift in how we operate. And the important thing there is that it means that we are not emitting carbon in the construction phase because we retain as much as possible. And we've seen a couple of big commercial clients come out recently explicitly stating that the best method of development is to retain as much of the original building that's on a plot as possible and only replace the bits that have to be replaced. So we're talking about a massive shift from knocking the whole thing down, having a nice clean sheet, and then building something new and sparkly that comes out fresh from a bag and we pop it in place. This is about intricately taking apart pieces of a building, ensuring that the structural integrity is retained, and then putting back something that will perform even better environmentally, because a great deal of the building's impact comes from the way it's operated.
Absolutely.
So ensuring that we can make that shift really does mean that we can't sit there as a contractor going, we know all about how every different component in this building works and can be removed and how the new ones can be put on, or exactly what a customer wants. or how we need to think about the regulatory framework that goes around reuse materials, or what the insurance implications are, or how our finance partners feel about it. We need to go and talk to them. We need to get people around the table and go, we've got part of this puzzle. What can you bring? How could we do this in a sector that traditionally has incredibly thin margins? How can we do this quickly and profitably? And that's the real puzzle that we've all got to work at. So even if you're a smallest contractor just getting going, or the largest and you've been around for years, we need to have the humility to go and talk to other people and go, we can see that this is needed. We can see this bit of the answer. Can you help us with this piece? Or do you know someone who can? And that opens up some incredible conversations.
So would you say a big part of the driver is client led, your customer led, saying this is how we want to build this particular development, or is it something that you would say, how about doing it this way? What's the collaboration there in terms
it comes from various routes. Definitely customers are on this journey. And you may have seen recently the announcement of a pilot of the net zero carbon building standard, which is a really pivotal moment for our sector. There have been numerous definitions of what a net zero carbon building is, which is not helpful for any of us. And the industry has got together with the professional bodies and 350 organizations and gone, let's agree on what this looks like. And we now have a pilot version which is out for testing, and that will give all of us clarity, and we can align our resources to deliver that together. So there's definitely something coming from customers. There's definitely something coming from the industry ourselves. We do not want to have a negative impact on the environment. So how can we do better? We definitely see a drive from our employees, and there's a real battle for good talent in the construction sector. So that's really important. Younger people today, we know from YouGov surveys particularly, they see our sector as dirty and boring. And if they could go to Google instead, they probably would. Yeah. So how do we clean up our act so that they can understand that this is a really extraordinary industry to be part of? So there's that whole piece. Obviously, the regulatory pressure is growing. And I think we'll see at the end of this month when the next Biodiversity International COP takes place. Yes. And they talk about translating the nature framework they agreed 2 years ago into action that each government will adopt. Even more drive for construction companies, particularly, to make a nature positive gain rather than just minimizing harm on the natural environment. So it's coming at us from all sides. I have to say, within Wates, we're family owned, and there is an absolute commitment from the Wates family that we get on the front foot with this, and we play a pivotal role in helping our sector to shift.
So would you say the direction has changed from being a nice to have to a must have?
Well, let me give you a couple of data points then. We have £3 billion worth of work. Remember, our turnover is about 2 billion. We have £3 billion worth of work in hand, our forward pipeline, that has to be delivered to very high BREEAM certification. That's not a nice to have. That's simply what we have to do at a base level now. In our residential developments business, 22 of the 24 major projects carry contractual social obligations. So the brilliant stuff that Shah's just been talking about, we don't get paid if we don't deliver the things that we have agreed to deliver on the social side with those projects.
Well, that's an actual contractual term now.
Absolutely. So, I mean, we don't have all the tracking in place yet to arrive at a figure of just what proportion of our turnover is subject to contractual, environmental and or social obligations. But I'm fairly sure we're up in the 80-90% already.
That's interesting to see it's becoming contractual terms, and presumably there'll be penalties associated with that in those contracts if you don't meet the requisite standards.
Absolutely. And that's going to tighten as well under the net zero carbon building standard that I just mentioned. The buildings not only have to be built to a certain standard, but they have to perform to the operational standard throughout their life to maintain that certification. And Ben also mentioned about value in buildings. We know that if a certification is lost, the value of the building reduces. So we will be on the hook for making sure that the building is capable, truly capable of performing to that standard, or there will be an impact on the, our very, very thin margins.
So it's a much longer term commitment for your business beyond the usual 12-year limitation period that we'd usually apply. So you're extending that and taking on that risk, I suppose, in the project that it is going to perform.
Yes, though all the lawyers on the call will be delighted to hear it's very complicated, because we could build it so that technically the building could perform to a certain standard, but the way it's used really matters.
Absolutely.
And I think what we're going to see as a result of this is probably quite an uptick in the use of smart building technologies, which have been quite slow to take off so far, truly to be used to their full potential. And that will help people understand how the building's operating, why it's operating like that, and what can be done about it. So I think we're going to see quite a shift very quickly once this pilot phase of the new standard is completed.
Well, I'll be watching that with interest, and perhaps we can persuade you to come back maybe in a year's time and tell us how it's all going.
Well, yes.
I suppose from a practical point of view, you've obviously got a considerable amount of experience in this area. For our contractors, perhaps, and that are listening today, what practical pointers could you say are good to bear in mind when you're managing ESG issues in the supply chain?
So suppliers are critical to success, and maybe to put that in context, about 2% of our overall footprint as weights is our own direct emissions. About 98% is within our supply chain. So we can't do better unless they also do better.
Yeah.
So in terms of what it's important to think about with suppliers, they are businesses who want to make the best margin they can, but they also innovate quietly behind the scenes and don't necessarily tell you unless you're asking the right questions. And so often in our sector, and I've been in real estate, built environment for 20 years, so often we'll go to a supplier and we'll say, could you give us a green version of this widget? And they go, well, we can, but it's going to be 15% more expensive. And we go, well, we can't do that because our margin's only 3% on this project. And we get nowhere. And actually asking different questions can really help. What we've been doing this year has been sitting down with some of our biggest suppliers and going, we've got ambition to make a real difference here. We know we don't have all the answers. What have you got going on that you think we should be listening to and looking at? And it takes them a little while to adjust to that because that's not the normal relationship to have in this sector. But it unlocks the richest conversation. They have, they know their products or their operations brilliantly in a way that we can never do. And they can say, well, actually, if you can change that bit over there, then we can change this and it won't cost any more, but the outturn will be a 30% lower carbon profile. And suddenly that means that we go and talk to the other supplier and we get them around the table and we make those pieces add up. So I would say it's not about individual products and trying to make them slightly better. That's incremental progress, and it's too late in the day to be looking at it incrementally. What we need to do is see how the pieces fit together differently and draw on that fantastic innovative thinking that's actually happening beneath the bonnet of this industry.
So similar to what Shah was saying, in a way, it's that collaboration piece that is really going to make this work in our industry.
That's absolutely right. I think go and talk to people. And I'm doing this internally within Weights. Actually, we acquired a business last week. So we've now got 6,000 people. So I've got a few more to talk to. But just going to talk to people and going, if there were one thing that you think would help, that you know about, that you can see, that hasn't actually surfaced in the business yet, what is it? And that has unlocked this incredible stream of amazing ideas, some of which are already now being put into progress, some of which it's too early, but we're going to come back to them. But then with suppliers, we're finding the same thing as well. And it just creates a deeper, more trusting relationship, which I think is incredibly important for our sector right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Just one final question, and thank you for what you've contributed so far. So if I was to give you a magic wand and you could make one change in the construction industry, what would it be?
A magic wand. Well, Time. We get an RFP, we put the tender in, we negotiate some more. Things change, we renegotiate it. And then by the time we have to start on site because the client's on a deadline, it's too late to take a breath and go, hold on, is there something we can do differently? For me, front loading that conversation of, I know you think you want X, but can we just take a breath and look at whether there might be a better approach that achieves your environmental aims better, more cost efficiently, and actually more quickly. And when I was at British Land, we did that quite successfully just by getting people around a table and taking that moment at the start of any project and going, how could we do this better? And then what are we going to adopt and go forward with? So time, please, Jess, with the magic wand.
Okay, I'll see what I can do. So it sounds to me that it's very akin to the sort of collaborative alliancing type contracts in a way, albeit without those in place, because I'm assuming you generally build under sort of more traditional models. But
Sure.
actually that's the approach that is going to really make a difference.
Yeah, and I would say, Jess, that I think this sector, with the recent collapse of ISG, bringing it into really sharp relief, we are not brilliantly sustainable economically, let alone environmentally. And if there was ever a moment to just go, is there a way of doing this differently? I think now's the time.
Well, thank you. Absolutely. On that note, we're going to make a slight shift of gear, but thank you for your time, Creston. I know we've got an opportunity for some Q&A at the end. So up next is James Ignotis, who's a litigator in our construction team and a principal associate. And James is going to be taking a quick look at litigation trends. So James, over to you.
Thank you very much. So I'm just in the context of this discussion today, I'm just going to be looking at some of the sort of key / most interesting things that I think might be coming down the track. It's not an exhaustive look at all types of litigation that might arise in the ESG sphere. Although obviously there are a huge number of things that I won't be touching on, and I'm sure people are aware of, for example, the number of claims that are being brought, for example, in Holland against Shell, because they're a major polluter. And there's obviously a huge amount of public policy wrapped up in that. So that they're obviously really, really important issues. But today we're just going to be focusing on three things in a slightly sort of horizon scanning way. And firstly, we're going to be looking at claims for environmental damage, which I think's become very topical because of the water companies gathering a lot of media attention. Ways to potentially ensure a building's performance, particularly sort of environmental performance, and that's sort of really going to be building on some of the things we heard from Krista, and then also enhanced obligations on supply chains. The first thing I really wanted to draw attention to was a recent case of Manchester Ship Canal versus United Utilities Water. In very summary terms, the Manchester Ship Canal company owned a ship canal in Manchester, and it was being polluted by the dumping of raw sewage into it from United Utilities. And so the Manchester Ship Canal brought a claim against the utilities company on the basis that it had for damages because of the presence of pollution. And to a lot of people's surprise, the Supreme Court decided that that claim could be brought. And I won't go into all the details of it, but that was a surprising decision for many. And I think it's obviously really, really topical because of all the attention that the water companies have been gathering for their dumping of raw sewage. And a lot of commentators have looked at this case and said, okay, that might be the first step in the court, particularly the Supreme Court in England and Wales, taking the view that they're not just going to allow water companies to get away with this, and actually they will have to face the consequences in litigation. I think if I was putting a contractor's hat on and thinking, okay, so how might this affect me? I think because obviously it's unlikely that your average contractor is going to be dumping raw sewage into waterways. I would think, well, actually, a lot of developments involve a measure of environmental protections. Indeed, I've had disputes in the past about populations of newts being impacted by housing developments. And I think that the sort of current trajectory seems to be that the courts will allow these claims more and more. And there are also a number of pressure groups, for example, Good Law Project, who are much more willing to bring these claims on behalf of members of the public. So I think the takeaway, I think, from this case is just to be much, much more alive to the risk of litigation and adverse media, but particularly risk of litigation in the context of this discussion. If you are a company that's perpetrating environmental damage. The next one I wanted to look at is how do we ensure a building's performance? And I think we obviously heard from Cressida about how this is becoming more and more and more of an issue, and how for Waits, a large percentage of their pipeline of work, I think we heard 3 billion pipeline of work, has got pretty strict standards built into it, environmental standards. And I think it's worth just pausing to look at what some of the main forms of construction contract are doing around this. So the JCT now has a provision which requires the contractor, or encourages, sorry, the contractor to suggest economically viable amendments to the works that might result in an improvement in environmental performance. And the NEC has something similar where it has provisions relating to climate change under one of the optional clauses. I think the general feeling in the industry, and certainly from the lawyers that I've been speaking with, is that these clauses are pretty woolly and don't actually create a very robust set of obligations. They're obviously, a move in the right direction, and that's to be commended. But these clauses themselves in the new standard forms of contract are not going to make the difference. And really, in order to give this teeth, it's the employer and the contractor at the outset of the project have to agree between them what the scope will be, and the extent to which that scope will mandate high environmental standards. It's really a bit too late once you're sort of into the works to have an obligation on the contractor to make suggestions, helpful as that might be. And I was then thinking, and I have been discussing with people, and this really is a horizon scanning point, because it's not something I've seen yet. But I was thinking, like, as a litigator, how could you actually enforce an obligation for example, have a certain U value, a certain thermal performance value within a building, and therefore reduce heating bills? And obviously, you can have in the employer's requirements or the scope a certain a requirement that the building will achieve X, but you then get run into the problem of, well, what if post completion, post defects period, it turns out that the building, even if it's being used optimally, is just simply not achieving that because, for example, the insulation isn't as good as it should be, or the glass that it's being glazed with is not as thermally efficient as expected. And the obvious answer is, well, you make a claim, and you make a claim for damages, but it can be massively difficult to quantify what your loss is in the context of reduced environmental performance, because it might be that the loss is a lack of tenants who want to rent the building, but that's very, very difficult to quantify. Or it might simply be that the developer wanted to do something good for the environment, which again is very, very difficult to quantify. So when I was thinking about this, I concluded that probably the best way to really give these provisions teeth would be to have some sort of post-completion performance liquidated damages regime. And by that I mean you would have to say the building will achieve thermal insulation performance of X, and for each specified unit by which it misses that, liquidated damages will be payable in the sum of Y. These clauses are really, really common in the power generation industry. So if you're building a power plant, you would expect to see a clause which says, if in year one you don't achieve a megawatt output of what of something specified, then you'll pay performance liquidated damages for each unit by which you miss it. So there is precedent in the industry for having these types of clauses. The only other thing I would note in relation to this is that I think if you were to try and put one of these clauses in, you'd have to be very, very specific. I don't think you could have something as generic as the building will be net zero, because there are just going to be too many vagaries, notwithstanding the report that Cressida mentioned about trying to better quantify what a net zero building is. I just think there would be too many vagaries as to whether or not you have or have not achieved the standard. So I could see this working in relation to very specific and measurable aspects of a building's performance. And the final thing I wanted to look at was some supply chain management. And this really caught my eye because there was a recent case, you can see there, Begum and Maran, where and the facts are quite sad and quite extraordinary. But basically, a shipbroker, Maran, arranged for an oil tanker to be demolished in Bangladesh. So the vessel was sold and it was sent off to Bangladesh to be broken. Um, Begum's husband was then killed in the shipyard in Bangladesh, um, because the health and safety practices were not adequate, and his widow claimed against the original shipbroker on the basis that it owed a duty of care to her husband because it arranged the demolition. So when I first looked at that, I thought that's a really long chain of things that have happened in order to get from the poor widow, Miss Begum, right through to Maran, the shipbroker based in the UK, which arranged for a ship to be sent halfway around the world to be broken up. Um, and the lawyers for Maran obviously agreed with that because they tried to take the case to the court and have it struck out immediately in a process called summary judgment. And I think to a lot of people's surprise, the court said, yeah, okay, the duty of care here has been strained, but we actually are not going to strike the case out straight away. And there might be a case to answer. There might be a duty of care here. So I think again, when I was looking into this, a lot of people have looked at that and said, okay, that might, a bit like the Manchester Ship Canal, that might be an indication that the courts are going to hold people to much, much higher standards, or hold companies to much higher standards in respect of their supply chains, and making sure that the way they can't just sort of wash their hands of liability once they push it into the supply chain. On that note, some people might be aware that France has got a duty of vigilance law, which is, I won't go into the details of it because it's quite complex in terms of how it operates, but the high level of it is that if you're a French company of a certain size, um, you have to you are essentially responsible for the activities of your entire supply chain, and you have to take steps to clean up any malpractice within your supply chain. And I guess most importantly, if you don't do that, you have a couple of bites at the cherry to put things right. But if you don't do that, then you face really, really hefty fines, like tens of millions of euros potentially. Um, and it, also in Europe, that's been complemented, I think, by the recent Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which I think, from memory, was published in June or July of this year. It's currently slightly unclear how that will be implemented. I mean, as the name would suggest, it's intended to make companies more responsible for their supply chains and ensure better standards throughout the supply chain. But it will be for member states, European member states, to implement implement the law, and also, most importantly, to decide how to give effect to it. So decide how to enforce it. But implementation will be between 2026 and 2029. So it's a bit of a watch this space at the moment. But again, I think that those three things, just examples pulled out, I think demonstrate how in the coming years there's going to be a much higher, there's going to be much more scrutiny on companies to maintain good standards throughout their supply chain. With that, I think I will hand back to Jess.
Thank you, James, for that quick sail through a few key litigation points. That was really interesting. We've had a question from the audience from Mary Claire O'Hara, and this is directed to Shah, but she says, what do you think about adding in contract penalties in supplier contracts for failure to achieve social value metrics?
That's a really great question, and it is a question that I get asked a lot. At the Games, we didn't have a penalty mechanism. We decided not to. We decided to go for more of a carrot approach rather than a stick approach, because we had like looming deadlines. We had quite a small supplier pool, so it presented some unique challenges. I have seen at least two councils who have started to include failure to kind of deliver on your social value commitments as part of their liquidated damages, and they've introduced them in their contract performance measures as well. I think it's risky. Who's going to be the first person to take a contractor to court for delivering a multi-million pound hospital on time, in budget, great quality, but you didn't offer the number of apprenticeships that you said you were going to offer? How would you demonstrate that loss? I think that's a risky thing to do. However, I do think there is a move in the market towards kind of considering other softer forms of penalties. So things like, I'm starting to see tenders now which have a higher weighting for social value, but also some where there is a pass-fail requirement for how well you answer that social value question. I've seen certainly two mental health trusts that have said that if you fail to deliver on your social value, there won't be a financial penalty, a direct financial penalty, but you may be excluded from their frameworks for the next 2 years. So we're starting to see that come in. But I think with the changes that are coming up in spring in the Procurement Act, there are a number of things there which may not result in a direct penalty, but which may kind of be disadvantageous to people who are not taking their social value commitments seriously. So, for example, there is a move from awarding it from the most kind of economically advantageous tender to the most advantageous tender. And the guidance from Cabinet Office has been that that can include things like, does it create local job opportunities? Does it have the social benefits? Even if it's financially a little bit more expensive, does it have more financial and local benefits for local communities and communities that are easy to be overlooked rather than another tenderer which might be slightly cheaper? I think as well, the changes to the Public Procurement Act of moving away from having to have regard to social value to a duty to consider social value, so a much higher test, and you have to have a good reason as to why you're not including social value. We'll also start to see kind of perhaps public procurement bodies think a little bit more about, okay, well, if we have to consider it and we have to put it in, what's going to happen if they don't deliver? I think the fact that you have to publish a minimum of 3 KPIs against each contract that is awarded through the public sector procurement, I think might lead to some interesting developments where we see a KPI on social value that's published, and you can see how people are scored against that and how they're delivering. But going back to what Cressida said about being able to do some early engagement with people before you put out a request for tender, the changes in the Procurement Act will kind of encourage that and really kind of make it clear that you can do that. You can speak to your suppliers, you can see what's out there, what might be possible. And I think that will allow people to kind of gauge if what they're asking for in their social value questions is deliverable. What does the market look like? What can people comfortably deliver? So I think, short story long, I think penalties is perhaps not the way to go and perhaps not what the appetite is in the market at the moment, but I do think there will be a move towards these softer types of penalties, which if you mount them up will have an incremental effect in the market, and I'm here for it.
Okay. Cressida, would you say that's fair, that from a risk perspective, your company, for example, would be reticent to engage in signing up to liquidated damages, for example, as James said, for failure to deliver on social impact?
Sure, it's a really tricky one, and measuring it is very, very hard. But I completely agree with what Shah just said. We see the Procurement Act as a very important moment in time. That transparency on the three KPIs for each project is going to create a very public arena of winners and losers quite quickly. It's also going to mean that companies operating in this arena realize that you have to properly resource, particularly social value obligations, which quite often people think just magically happen in the corner. Am I right, Shah?
Yes,
And this and learning from what we've done and what it took to deliver it, and therefore using that to inform future negotiations of what we will commit to deliver, I think will actually create much better outcomes over time because everyone will take it seriously. So yeah, I'm completely aligned with Shah's representation.
If I could
Yeah.
just add as well, sorry, one of the things that when we are supporting people to score social value questions, one of the things that we encourage is, right, okay, you need to look at not just like the person who's promised the highest donation to charity and the highest number of volunteer hours and the highest number of apprenticeships. What is their plan for doing that? Have they done this before? What's realistic? How do they resource this internally? Is that all set out in the answer to their question? And even if that means that somebody has is delivering less in terms of a verified figure, but they have a plan and you have more confidence in how they will deliver that and they can take that more seriously. We support people to score that question more highly than somebody who just breezes in, making all of the promises, knowing that it's not going to end up in liquidated damages. And I think, some people do hide behind that and will promise the term that social value managers use is plink fluffy unicorns, knowing that it's not going to be, knowing that they won't be challenged about it. So I think some of the softer moves is perhaps where the market will move to rather than direct penalties.
Preston, just picking up on that, do you sense that Waits would be willing to accept liquidated damages for certain environmental performance? So, for example, if you had a requirement to have solar panels on the roof generating X amount of electricity and actually it turned out none of them worked, is that the type of thing where you might accept liquidated damages?
James, we would never put ourselves in that position. We would always make sure it works. But you should probably talk to our lawyers.
We'll do that. Thanks, Cressida. Just moving on to sort of the environmental and social impact of buildings. One of the questions that we've received, and perhaps Ben, you might be well placed to answer this. It's been posted anonymously, but the attendee asked if buildings are old, how are they actually tested for environmental and social impact? And we see some very old buildings, 60s tower blocks. How do you make the decision that it's better to restore them or knock them down?
So I'm going to do the lawyer's answer of dodging the technical question in terms of how you assess social and environmental impact. There are people with clipboards far cleverer than I who can do that. But it does raise a really good question about how planning works, in that you have all these issues that sort of get thrown into the planning mix, and and local authorities decide which are the most important. And I think, for example, on these 60s tower blocks, yeah, carbon and keeping structures is really important from a carbon perspective. But you've also, first and foremost, you've got to have a safe structure for people to live in. And we've seen in history that if a building is not safe, terrible consequences. So human safety has to come above carbon, I suspect. You've also got things like, the sort of the visual amenity. Some tower blocks are wonderful structures and some are less attractive. We have a thing called listing where you can preserve buildings because of their architectural or historic significance as well. So there's all sorts of things that get thrown into the mix to decide whether we should keep older structures. And I suspect for the short term, carbon will not be the overriding principle. It will be a very important one, but it will not override safety, people's well-being. Do people want to be in there? If people don't want to live in there because it's not safe or doesn't make them feel happy, you can have all the good carbon assessments and environmental arguments, but that structure shouldn't be there. Having said that, we need urban dense buildings. We need to be the tall urban buildings are often the most sustainable because of transport links and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, it's a great exam question about how does planning work.
It'd be interesting as well, I suppose, to see what the government does with the Grenfell Phase 2 report recommendations and how those are going to be incorporated into practices or legislation, and how that's going to impact what developers decide to do in terms of, and planning authorities, I suppose, as well, in terms of keeping older buildings and weighing up the sort of risk benefit of doing that as against building safety. I think we're all waiting to see how the government is going to respond to the numerous recommendations that have been made there. Just moving on, I suppose I've got just a question for James. We've talked a bit about sort of the litigious options and perhaps the contractual routes to enforcing ESG objectives. Are there any sort of non-litigation options where perhaps a claimant might be, worried about the risk associated with taking a claim to the courts, for example? What other means are there for enforcing these types of duties?
Yeah, so I think as you've touched on, your sort of usual route is to go to the courts, but there are also other options available, and I think in particular, um, a number of sort of jurisdictions, countries have regulatory routes available, where there are sort of various ombudsman type groups or regulators who have enforcement powers that sit not immediately in a court where you have to sort of make a claim and go through that entire process. So there are other routes available in that sense as well. Um, I suppose also if you're under a construction contract in England, you've got adjudication and as an option, and then any other number of options that might be agreed between the parties, sort of be it expert determination or the like. But I think, yeah, the key ones to remember, particularly outside of the UK, is that a number of countries do have these sort of regulatory enforcement routes and ombudsmans and the like.
And I wonder, in fact, if maybe that's part of the answer when we're sort of hearing that for commercial reasons, contractors are perhaps going to be reluctant to sign up to severe penalty clauses directly relating to ESG issues. But perhaps if there's a mixture of contractual routes together with regulatory routes, then that will help shift the dial, perhaps to make people more compliant with these issues.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely fair comment. Yeah.
Well, thank you. We've only got a few minutes left, so I just have a question that's come in for you, Cressida, which says, how is Wates addressing the skilled worker shortage, and how does ESG factor in retaining and attracting talent?
ESG is really important in our recruitment process now. We are getting proactively asked about it from people you wouldn't necessarily expect. So if someone's coming in for an operations director job, traditionally on the gritty end of the scale and not necessarily the softer end of the scale as it would have been seen in the old days, we're getting asked, what are you doing about this? Do you think it's enough? Are you going to go further? So we know it's important to recruit the smartest people that we can to our business. And what are we doing about the skills shortage? I think there are two elements to this. The first one is generally we're not attracting sufficient people to the sector. We've had a massive program with schools. We've got research, in fact, everyone's got research that shows that if you wait until people are in secondary school, it's too late. They're already turned off by the idea. So I think last year we reached 28,000 primary school children to get them thinking about this. And then because we have projects all over the country, we try and maintain those links and keep the children interested. And then we have a big early careers program where we go out and we find them. So we just welcomed our latest cohort of 106 very, very bright young people. And they each one of those 106 people beat 57 other people to get their one place. So we actually don't have too much of a problem attracting younger people to Waits. The second element, though, I think, is the green skills shortage as we transition to whatever the new world looks like. And I think there is an expectation for companies like like Waits, other tier one contractors, to be investing in helping people with old world skills. So fitting gas boilers, for instance, to train to fit heat pumps instead, for example. That is something we're very alive to and considering where we can play a role.
Thank you. That's amazing to hear actually that there's so much competition for those places within your business. And encouraging because we do hear about skill shortage in this country, especially post Brexit. But if companies like yours are working hard to get people engaged at an early age, hopefully that will help to
Yeah,
overcome that.
I should say though, Jess, that the supply chain, parts of the supply chain really struggle to get people in. And we've seen a massive hit post Brexit of getting people into the trades. We're
Yeah.
great at positioning ourselves and showing we're a long-term business. We're not going to go bust. We're careful. We've got big plans for the future. Some of our trades aren't quite in that space and don't have the same capacity as us to build those relationships, to draw people in. But we do a lot of work with them through the projects that we have to help them connect with secondary schools and draw people through on apprentices. So we do as much as we can, and always looking for ways to do more with other people in the industry so that we're talking with a single voice.
Yeah, absolutely. We've probably got time for perhaps one or two more questions. I did promise we'd try and finish a little bit early, but we're shortly running out of time. Question for you, Ben. We hear the term responsible business used a lot in the media and corporate literature. What, in your view, does it really mean to be responsible? Big
So I think
question.
yeah, 2 minutes. So I think for me, it's about being sort of truly thoughtful and thinking about all of your stakeholders, not just your investors and your customers. It's thinking about people, whether it's in the communities you're operating in, your employees, people who work for your suppliers, or just society at large. And I think it's about sort of being thoughtful about all of your impacts. There's a massive focus on carbon. I get that. But you need to think about nature. You need to think about resources, water. You need to think about a much sort of broader variety of issues. Modern slavery, human rights, all that kind of stuff. I think you need a realistic plan. How you're addressing those issues, not just we're going to be net zero. We're going to be super responsible by this date, and we have no idea how we're going to get there. And I think there's about a communication issue as well in terms of talking very authentically and realistically to people about what you're doing. And I think the final point on responsible business is, I talk a lot about, when I'm talking to clients about ESG, I talk about Moscow, what you must do, what you should do, what you could do, and what you won't do. And I think being a responsible business is going beyond the must. That basic legal compliance, that's fine. It's thinking about what you should and could do, what your values are. And I think Cresta made it, he talked about being fourth generation family owned. The values, what the legacy of that family is, will run through the business. Like a sort of a green thread, and it's there are lines you just don't cross way beyond what their legislation says. So I think responsible businesses talk about legacy, their values, and they live and breathe those things.
Thank you, Ben. We've pretty much run out of time. I know we've got a few questions that we haven't got to today, but we will pick these up after the session and come back to you separately if needed. This has been a fantastic session, and Ben, Shah, Presta, James, thank you for being part of it today and sharing your views and knowledge. I think for me, there's a few key themes that have come out of it, one of which is collaboration is the key to change. One of which is regulation and benchmarking, ombudsman's contractual terms. There's lots of different routes, including softer routes that Shah has talked about as well. And it's the combination of those, I think, that need to work together to really bring about the change and keep firing the direction of travel that we've talked about, that the industry is on a journey towards. So once again, thank you to everyone. I hope everyone who has joined today has found this talk to be interesting. There are lots of you, so it shows how important the topic is. We all look forward to future opportunities to continue this conversation, and I hope you all have a lovely rest of your day. Thank you very much.